Hello, everybody. I am going to begin to explain here kind of what my analysis of was of the article in their own words, using self-assessments of college readiness to develop strategies for self-regulated learning. I thought this was a really interesting article. It was the first time that I have really looked in this in depth into quantitative. Well, I guess in a while, but definitely at this critical lens, the first time ever. And I think it was really interesting. I think it was a good article to start with down that road, and I feel like I learned quite a bit. Let me get into my analysis. The first strength that I noticed was just the overall writing. I feel like the just really well written article, even aside from research perspective, just well written, flowed really well. Readability level was high. I felt like it was interesting and it captured my attention. I cannot say the same about a lot of other articles. So to me, that caught my eye. The use of embedded quotes, I have to say, is something that I admire. And when I first noticed the percentage of the writing that is actually an embedded quote versus where it's one embedded quote per paragraph that's unpacked is astonishing. And this article did it really well. I've seen other articles try to do that, and it's confusing. I almost wish they would do more unpacking. But this article found a nice balance even when they weren't unpacked. It just seemed like they chose the right quote for the right part and really leveraged it in such a way that allowed them to really showcase a lot of the literature that they had reviewed while at the same time keeping the flow of the writing. And how they did that is really was masterfully done, so I wanted to really mention that. Headings. Oh yeah, also I noticed that it was almost at the end, it kind of built up to that call to action at the end, and it made it in a way persuasive. I know with expository writing, you're not supposed to do that. I don't mean it was persuasive in tone at all. I just mean that the takeaway at the end was kind of left the reader. I feel like they had made a point and really advocated for that point. So I felt that that was strong. Headings and subheadings, well, there were not as many as the previous article. I feel that there were enough and in the right places and really helped the reader along. So um, I don't know. I would say that was contributed to the readability, and then the results and the discussion was so thorough that I think it really kind of gave left the reader, if depending on how deep the reader needed to go, that was available to them. So I felt that the results in the discussion were were a strength. Number two was the methods, to get a little bit more into that section and the sources of evidence. I think that it was certainly specific enough to recreate. It provided the survey for the readers to see exactly what was given. So because of that, I felt that it was, um, you know, that was a strength. I think some of the other articles that I've looked at, I don't know that I would be able to recreate it, but this one I feel like I could. Problem statement was understood. I'll get to that in a second as a critique, but nevertheless, it was laid out and I was able to kind of get it through what I had been reading. But the results were clearly laid out and the methods were easy to recreate. So I give that a second strength. Now into the problem statement more deeply, I'm leaving it as a criticism simply because you need to infer it. So while I think it's a strength that it becomes apparent, I do now I'm left confused whether or not it should have its own section. I think it should. And that seems to be kind of what the class that we're currently taking would lend one to think. However, I don't know. That's kind of a question I have because it can be inferred. Nevertheless, I'm leaving it as a criticism because I'm always expecting now to kind of see it clearly laid out. And so my question is, should they be separated or embedded? And I'm kind of now left confused, and I don't know that that should ever be the case, especially if somebody who's reading multiple articles, which I think is often the case, and they need to readily find the information they're looking for. To me, I would feel that it would behoove any writer to have that a clear section. Nevertheless, it was easy to find or easy to infer from the data, which I think is attributable to the overall writing quality. But again, I think if it can be made more clear to the reader, I think it should. And so I think that that's a criticism. I would like to see the problem statement have its own clear demarcated section. The second critique was literature review, in that I didn't see one. Like, I don't know that there is one. I mentioned earlier that there were a lot of awesome quotes that were embedded really well, which lends to the fact that a lot of literature was reviewed. But again, these are things that are left to an inference. I would like to see a clear cut literature review. And one of the things that I have learned in this course is the point of the literature review is to see that synthesis of thought. And if I'm not seeing that clearly, then that's a criticism. I would love to see that. I would love to see how they had combined their literature and kind of given that thematic insight, or that synthesis of what was going on to kind of lend to the problem and link all that together. And I think that, again, if it can be done, then it should, because it will only make it that much more readable, and that much more discoverable, especially when people are trying to navigate through multiple research articles to find what they're looking for. And again, because of that as well, not sure that there is a gap in the research that would explain why this particular study needs to be done. And so that would always help to kind of, fill in the, for the reader, kind of draw that line between that. So I think that would only help to have been given a clear literature review section. As far as takeaways, well, one thing as a side note, I'm beginning to notice the role of self-regulation as a trend in several articles now, and that's awesome to me, and something that in my own personal interest of research would like to pursue more. And so that's one thing that I take away, seeing that self-regulation as a skill for learners is just now becoming more pervasive, and I'm really glad to see that there's a lot of research around that, beginning to see that. So that's just kind of on the side note, but definitely a takeaway. Number two, quantitative. Earlier in this module, I learned about how it can be used to identify a problem. And one of the areas for me of growth within this course is kind of seeing how not to approach research already with a predetermined with a specific issue in mind, but more of kind of why is there a problem. And in this module, I seen how quantitative can be used for that. Kind of interesting. And again, you see it in this article, where they're using quantitative study to identify a problem, not solve a problem, but just to identify it. And so I think that's kind of interesting, and something that I'm beginning to kind of learn more about, in terms of the role that quantitative would play. Quantitative seems scary to me as somebody liberal arts background, and I'm definitely want to think qualitative, but when I interpret quantitative in this way, it kind of makes it a little bit less scary, more manageable, and I'm beginning to see how maybe that might be something that I could possibly tackle within my own research, at some point. So that's kind of a takeaway I have that is kind of optimistic. Call to action. In the end, there was a call to action. Haven't seen that before. That was interesting. And I'm not sure if that's normal or how often that happens, but it's something that was at least noticeable and mentionable that they did have that. They also talked about the presentations that they did. So it's kind of like a transfer of what they learned into what they put into practice. Hadn't seen that before either, so something mentionable. I thought that was really interesting. I'll be curious to see if in other articles, writers mention that, kind of what they do with what they learn in such a concrete way. So that was something definitely that I hadn't seen. And then quantity over quality, no pun intended. I didn't realize that would be a joke until I wrote it. But usually quality is what, as a close reader, I would want to do. Just prior to this class, prior to this program, anytime I do close reading, I really want to understand, get in there, reread, really get a depth of understanding, of comprehension from anything that I read. What I'm beginning to understand from this course is kind of to let go and really look at the articles more holistically, look at the abstract, look at the findings, and kind of skip around. And instead of getting so hung up on really trying to break down one article to the point where I really feel comfortable, look at several articles and look at what the similarities and the differences are between those. So it's kind of, in that sense, more of a broader, it's a different reading skill. And so I'm finding that, as for this course, it's a huge takeaway, because I was coming in here more worried about the writing. But now it's like I'm really developing a new sense of how to read. in a totally different way and analyze these research articles. So that's kind of exciting and interesting, something, that I'm finding myself getting better at with more practice. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to hearing your feedback.